Go ahead, Gerry.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. We have hundreds of you here already, which is great and much appreciated. And I know others will join over the course of this introduction. For those of you who are regulars, you're going to see we're doing something a little bit different on this latest installment of our bi-weekly series. We have our regular three panelists, our three COVID leaders, Donna Lynne, Wafaa El-Sadr, and Melanie Bernitz. But we also have three special guest panelists today. So this is especially intimidating for me, not just three experts with advanced degrees, but six today. Our three special guests are Magda Sobieszczyk, Lou Batista, and Zev Williams, all very distinguished faculty members at CUIMC. They, in part one of this conversation today, are going to focus on vaccine safety and efficacy. I'm not going to tell you a lot about them. You came to hear from them, not about them, so we'll let them get to that. But just a couple of housekeeping points. This is recorded. If you want to see it again afterwards, it will be available for that. There is a Q&A box as always, and we invite you to put your questions there. We'll answer as many of them as we can during this session. Those that we don't get to during the session, we always try to pick up afterwards. So if you don't hear an answer today, that doesn't mean your question is lost. But I think we can proceed without further ado to Magda, and she and Lou and Zev each have brief presentations. And as always, there will be ample time for Q&A afterwards, which Donna will moderate. So Magda, over to you. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I will share with you just a few kind of key issues that come up and have recently come up about vaccine safety. And then it will be great to answer questions that may be generated by this brief presentation. So I'm Magda Sobieszczyk, as Gerry mentioned. Next slide. So the next couple of slides will really, so this one first will just kind of emphasize the fact that there is a really, as many of you know, a very robust system in place to monitor COVID-19 vaccine safety. It's both an active and a sort of passive surveillance system. And one I wanted to highlight especially is the vSafe system, which is a smartphone-based active safety monitoring, which has been in place for many vaccines and has certainly been sort of implemented kind of robustly for COVID-19 vaccines. And as of a month ago, the age limits have been expanded to allow registration of younger individuals, 12 years of age and above, and they can either fill it out themselves, report sort of any symptoms following the first dose of COVID vaccine, or have their parents or caretakers do it for them. The VERIS system is a great system that's utilized by providers to report any adverse events to the CDC. Next slide. And then lastly, this clinical immunization safety assessment project is a system that's been in place for over a decade. Is really kind of conducts both sort of clinical research and assesses very complex clinical adverse events that may follow vaccination, and has been really very helpful in assessing kind of causality and etiology of thromboembolic or blood clots, especially after the Janssen vaccine. As of just last week, I wanted to remind everyone that over 300 million doses of COVID vaccines have been administered in the US, and this system has certainly been working quite soundly to highlight any safety issues and answer lots of questions that come up. Next slide. So what I wanted just to highlight is a topic that's been now seems a little bit old. It's certainly hasn't been in the news recently. Kind of this the issue of blood clots and low platelets that have occurred after receiving the J&J or the Janssen vaccine. But I want to highlight it because it really illustrates how kind of the post-marketing or post-authorization safety monitoring continues. And this particular event, which was extremely rare of blood clots and low platelets that was noticed after the J&J vaccine, was extremely rare, but it was picked up quite quickly. So now we know sort of counsel that individuals, women who are younger than 50 years old should be aware of this increased risk. The rate is quite low, about 7 individuals per 1 million vaccinated women between the ages of 18 and 49 years old. And it's even rarer for people who are older than 50 years old and men of any age. Next slide. And so when sort of, talking to potential vaccinees or patients who are women above the age of 50, really there are no contraindications to getting the J&J vaccine or the Janssen vaccine, but it's just something that they need to be aware of. Similarly, for patients or individuals with a history of a blood clot or maybe a risk factor for a blood clot, there are just sort of a conversation that should be had with a clinician, but no contraindications. With the one exception that maybe if someone has had a blood clot sort of kind of induced by heparin, for example, or kind of an immune-mediated blood clot that happened within the last 90 days or so, they should be offered another COVID-19 vaccine. But if they had a history of more remote blood clots, even if it's the underlying mechanism was an immune-mediated blood clot, there's really no contraindications to vaccination. And similarly, we don't advise patients to take blood thinners or anticoagulants prior to taking any COVID vaccine. Next slide. So some of you may have seen sort of recent reports of a couple of other events that have been reported following the mRNA, Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. And these are reports of what we call myocarditis and pericarditis, which is sort of inflammation of the heart muscle or the lining of the heart that has been noted through this VAERS system that I mentioned to you earlier. And it's been noted to sort of occur mainly in male adolescents and young adults above the age of 16 years old. And it's been noted to occur a little bit more frequently after the second dose than the first dose. And it's the symptoms of chest pain, palpitations, and fatigue, so shortness of breath really happen within several days after the COVID vaccination. It is a very rare event considering the number of mRNA doses that have been administered. But because the observed number of reports was a little bit higher than number of expected cases in this particular age group, 16 to 24 years of age, this certainly triggered a very close investigation. There's lots of data that is still being collected in terms of outcomes and causality, and there'll be a special panel that will be convened at the end of this week to review all of these cases. Majority of them have full recovery of symptoms and are doing well. But again, sort of highlighting kind of the robust safety monitoring system that's in place. Next slide. Another common topic that comes up often is allergies and reactions to vaccines. So for example, people ask, is it safe to get an mRNA vaccine if especially if you've had something called a COVID arm, which is essentially kind of a rash that can be itchy, swollen, and painful. It can happen after the first injection of the mRNA vaccine, and it can happen right, a couple of days afterwards, or even up to a week later after the first injection. And I showed some pictures here of these reactions, which can be, quite pronounced. Typically in these cases, they resolve and it's safe to get the second shot. And likewise, really individuals who have sort of food allergies, environmental allergies, it's safe for them to get the mRNA vaccine. The only sort of cautionary, and they may be advised to, if it's a severe reaction, they may just be advised to be observed a little bit longer following the injection. The only sort of cautionary notes would be for individuals who have a history of anaphylaxis to any component of the mRNA vaccines and who have an allergy to the PEG, which is a component of both mRNA vaccines. And certainly individuals who had anaphylaxis after the first dose of mRNA vaccine should not get the second dose of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. Next slide. I'm showing you here the components of the mRNA vaccine because that's not that any of you sort of would remember them, but they're listed here and they're sort of publicly available. Again, the reaction that most commonly occurs is to the PEG component, which is kind of the inactive lipid coating of the vaccine. Other question that often comes up is, what about people with egg allergies? What about people with latex allergies or sort of allergies to certain preservatives? So those components, those sort of things are not contained in the vaccine. So people can be reassured that if they have an egg allergy, they don't have to worry about allergy to the vaccine. Next slide. Just to sort of finish off, and this may generate some questions later on, but one question that comes up is oftentimes about individuals with immune compromising conditions. First of all, should they get the vaccine? And the answer is yes, absolutely. I think, I'm sure you've heard in the previous presentations, that individuals who especially are, for example, transplant patients, they're at an increased risk of getting COVID and need to be vaccinated. There's some early data coming in, very early preliminary, that need to be sort of studied in larger studies, but that there's some conversations about whether or not these individuals may even warrant a third dose of the vaccine, but more studies are needed. So let me stop here and I'll pass it on to my colleagues, and then I'm looking forward to questions.
Okay, so it's my turn. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. So for your luck, I did not prepare any slides, and the reason I decided to do so is so you can see me, you can see us, and then that can feel more like a conversation rather than a presentation. So and the point I'm making about the conversation is that it should be ongoing, right? It should not stop here today the way it has been. So, so that's my first point. So, I feel that I'm having this conversation with you today wearing my peer hat, and a hat that gave me the opportunity to listen and learn from many of our colleagues over the last several months about their struggles, their challenges, and certainly their anxieties. So my comments today are largely a product of the feedback that I have received from our own people. So I'd like to share a few thoughts on two related areas. Certainly vaccine, specifically vaccine hesitancy. And if we have time, I'll make a couple comments about return to campus. So first, I'd like to make you aware or remind you of a resource that was launched a few weeks ago, the Vaccine Champion Program, particularly for people that have not yet been vaccinated. We launched this program initially based at the medical center, and the purpose of this program was really to have a peer-driven resource locally. So in addition to the large forums, people that have not yet been vaccinated, that still have concerns and apprehension about the vaccine, had the opportunity of having these conversations with a peer that has been trained, that has access to a lot of information about the common themes and concerns about the vaccine in a smaller setting, a more private setting, leveraging the relationships. So if you feel this might be a good time, an appropriate time to reach out to these resources and having conversations with a peer, I encourage you to reach out. If you're not sure if your school or unit has a assigned champion, feel free to reach out to me, and I will make sure that I connect you with the right people and the right resources. So, for our colleagues that have been vaccinated, I have a couple of comments for you. So first, thank you for doing so. And I think, but also it's important for us that have been vaccinated already to remind ourselves that vaccine hesitancy is often multifactorial, and knowledge alone is proven not to be the only factor at play when we make personal decisions. And we see that playing out in elections. We see that when we make other personal decisions, and certainly that is playing out around vaccine hesitancy. I think the complexity for us, and again, I'm talking to you as a peer, is that we don't live or work in isolation. So, the decisions that we make individually about getting the vaccine or not will affect our collective health and well-being. So having said that, I think it's important to remind ourselves that our colleagues that have chosen not to be vaccinated just yet, they're not bad people, they're not bad colleagues. And one of the commonalities of hesitancy is that it often comes from a belief that which is often associated to a concern that is then linked to fear and anxiety. So trying to argue, trying to strong arm people to get a vaccine, is not only helpful, but actually has the opposite effect. It just, marginalizes and isolates people further. So if you want to try to be helpful to our colleagues that still have apprehension about the vaccine, we need to listen. We need to try to understand the concerns and trying to assist them and access the resource and support available that they think might be helpful to them. Now, for the people that our colleagues that have not yet been vaccinated, it is understandable that with the recent mandate, you might have caused more apprehension and certainly put more pressure on you. And I hope you can also understand that that complex decision also comes from a place of firmly believing that that action was the safest approach to protect our community. So I encourage you to access the resources available right now if you believe will be helpful to you. Now, in regards to return to campus, and I think it would be remiss if I didn't at least validate that, because there's a lot of anxiety about that, voiced by people that have been, still primarily working remote, but also from our HR partners, from managers. They have to make this work and bring people back, to campus. What I would say is that it's understandable, that it's expected that there will be a level of stress and anxiety, with yet another transition and changes again of schedules, routines, childcare. And some of this anxiety is not going to go actually fully away until we go through the transition and have the chance to actually adjust. Now, that is different if you are experiencing a level of anxiety that is debilitating, is affecting your ability to make decisions, to plan and engage, is affecting your well-being. Then again, I encourage you to access the resources and help available. There's a lot. I mean, that's through COPE Columbia, through HR, through EAP, through Work Life. And if you're not sure which resources might be the best fit for you, again, you're welcome to reach out. And I'm happy to try to give you guidance in terms of accessing the right resource for you at this time. So I'll stop here and I'll be happy to answer questions as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lou, and Dr. Baptista. If it's possible, could we pull up my slides? Terrific. So as Dr. Baptista mentioned, there is a lot of fear and anxiety right now concerning the vaccine and its safety. And it does seem that there's a particularly intense focus on the effects on fertility. And I think this sort of forum that we have today, this opportunity for the whole community to come together and to discuss in a very upfront and transparent way these fears, is enormously valuable. And so thank you to Gerry and Donna Lynne for doing this. And if we could advance to the next slide, I'll just sort of go through what I think will be helpful. So in the next few minutes, what I thought we could do together was to go through what are the concerns. Really to zero in on the fears that exist and the basis for them. And then, as is often the case, bring in the science. What are the facts behind it? And finally, end with some of the recommendations that exist. Go to the next slide, please. So the interesting thing about the fear of the vaccine in many communities now is the link between the vaccine and causing infertility for many communities is a leading cause of vaccine hesitancy. And it's really helpful to try and delve into why that is. And so we can see if there's a basis for it, and if not, how we can overcome that. Vaccines and infertility have a long and unfortunate link in terms of the fear that's existed. In multiple vaccines in the past, there's been this recurring theme about, oh, maybe it could be causing infertility. This happened with the HPV vaccine. It's happened with Ebola vaccines, even in the absence of any data. I think part of that has to do with the fact that we do have a very tenuous relationship with fertility in general. It's often lost without symptoms. It's very scary when that's lost. It's a deep-seated fear that many of us have for ourselves, for our spouses, our children. And we have this concern that sort of exists. There's no underlying symptoms to it. And there are many misconceptions and myths surrounding fertility. I'm showing a picture. This is a mini-series put on by Amazon called Utopia that was about, it was aired 7 years ago, so long before COVID, but it was about a pharmaceutical company that developed a vaccine specifically to cause infertility. So this is a recurring thing that we have. However, COVID in particular seems to be a nidus, a pinpoint for these types of fears. We can have the next slide. A lot of this stemmed from a blog post that occurred very, very early on in the epidemic. In December 5th, 2020, a purported head of there was a post that went really viral. So a lot of our social media helped spread a lot of these misconceptions very quickly. There was a post saying that a head of Pfizer was saying this vaccine causes female sterilization. That's a headline that would terrify anybody to see. And so the question was, what was the claim that was being made? We go forward one slide. So the claim that was being made, and what really started, I think, this whole snowballing effect, was that the spike proteins that were what the vaccine targets. So when you get the vaccine, it has components to it that resemble the spike protein that's on SARS-CoV-2, and those elicit an immune response. And when you have antibodies against these spike proteins, it prevents the virus from being able to infect you. So the vaccine is to create these antibodies targeting the spike. The claim was being made that this spike is very similar to some of the proteins on the surface of the placenta. And so that when you got the vaccine, not only would you be making antibodies against the spike of SARS-CoV-2, but these antibodies would also cross-react with the surface of the placenta and cause infertility. So the first thing to do is say, well, is that true or not? Can we go forward one slide? So we and a number of other groups, we can go forward one more, studied this and have shown that there was essentially no significant homology between this protein that was claimed to be the target of the cross-reactive target on the placenta and the actual spike protein. Can we go forward one more? And Pfizer, in fact, in a response to all of this, came out and said that clearly there is no significant homology between the two. So the underlying basis for these fears have been shown not to be true. But what about the actual data? What about the data that we've actually seen since using this in the clinical trials and afterwards? If we go forward one more slide. This data too has thankfully been incredibly reassuring. So for example, in the Pfizer trial with almost 40,000 people enrolled, 23 women conceived after they received the first injection, and roughly half and half, 12 in the vaccine group, 11 in the placebo group, and there was one miscarriage who happened to have been in the placebo group. So in the initial trials, no evidence of harm, no evidence of a decreased ability to conceive. As Dr. Sobieschik mentioned, the CDC is also following this through their V-Safe program and following pregnancy. And again, the data coming out from that has all been very, very reassuring. So we don't have a biological plausibility behind it, and we don't have any evidence from any of the clinical trials that the vaccine causes infertility. Can we go forward one more slide? So the last claim is the actual basis behind the concern to begin with. So the theory is that you're going to be cross-reacting with this one protein on the virus, and that cross-reactivity, when it's given as that vaccine, can target the placenta. The reality is the vaccine does just produce that one spike protein. The virus itself also has that spike protein, in addition to 27 other proteins, plus the active virus itself. So if there was any concern about the vaccine, you'd expect it to be greatly amplified with the actual virus. In the US, unfortunately, now we've had over 30 million cases in the US as of today. There has not been a significant increase in fertility or miscarriage that's been noted, but I will tell you, for many of us, while we are very reassured about the data about the vaccine and infertility, the effect of the actual virus is something that it remains to be determined. And the reason I emphasize that is for those of us who really want to make sure we can help preserve fertility as best we can, I think vaccine, if anything, would be a step in the right direction. So the summary, if we can have the last slide. In summary, there are these widespread vaccines, and this concern about the vaccine and infertility predates the COVID-19 vaccine, but it's particularly intense with it. Thankfully, the data has been reassuring from the clinical trials and the V-Safe follow-up data that we have. Because the vaccine doesn't have an actual live virus, they're not thought to increase any risk of infertility, first or second trimester losses, congenital anomalies. And the American Society of Reproduction has reaffirmed their stance that they recommend vaccines for anybody who's considering pregnant or who is pregnant in order to minimize the risks to themselves in their pregnancy. I will tell you as well, just anecdotally, I'm very fortunate at Columbia University Fertility Center to work with 10 of what I think are some of the smartest, most well-read, thoughtful fertility specialists in the world. And every one of them got the vaccine as soon as they became available, including 2 who were pregnant at the time. So I think it's not something that we're saying, but that we're practicing as well.
Thank you, Zev. And we're going to take a little bit of a break now. I would encourage you to, again, go into the Q&A box. We have 43 questions in the Q&A box. We've been answering them by responding live to you through the answer function, and we've gotten to about 30. But for our medical experts in particular, there are a number of questions. We're going to take a little pause for about 5 or 6 minutes to also remind you that one of the important aspects of the vaccine mandate is that you upload that information and provide it to Columbia. It is confidential. The only people that see this information are from human resources, who will be dealing with compliance. And what we have asked you to do, and you may have seen this in some of the memorandum that have gone out, as well as the website, is to upload your vaccine information by August 2nd. And if you are applying for an exemption, which we'll go into a little more detail, that you also do that by August 2nd. But Robert is going to put up a very brief 5 or 6 question quiz. Again, the responses are anonymous. We don't have your names to be able to track to the answers, but we would like to, because we want to make sure you can do the technical aspects of loading your information, is to get a sense from you if you have been vaccinated, if you've uploaded your information through our app, which is called Reopen CU, and then if there are particular issues that you're having, then I'm going to share a few screens with you to show you how to do this if you have not been able to do it already. So we're going to take a few minutes to open up the poll, and you can click on your answers, hit submit at the end, and then Robert will give us a tally.
Donna, I'm seeing in the chat that some people are having trouble because you have to submit an answer to question 3, even if it isn't applicable.
Okay. How about if they just put, maybe a suggestion would be just put other?
Exactly.
And that will clear you out, and then we can tally the poll as we have it. Thanks, Gerry. Appreciate that. Robert, do we want to just even do a preliminary tally?
We have to close the poll to do that.
Okay.
But we'll close the poll in just like 45 seconds.
Okay, great. I'm watching the number of questions continue to grow.
Yeah. And just to repeat, if question 3 is inapplicable, just hit other, and that should let you submit.
To 80%, so I'll give it another 10 seconds or so.
Okay, so we have some answers. 91% of you have been vaccinated, which is great to hear. But about only a little over half of you have uploaded the information, which is great because I'm going to walk through and show you, given this big 67%, we don't know what that means in terms of the other, but I have a few brief slides, and then for those of you who have not uploaded the information, it might make you more comfortable in doing that, and then we'll turn back to our growing list of questions. So thanks for participating in the poll, and Robert, if you could share my slides. I'm going to do a quick little walkthrough of a few screens. Okay, go to the next slide. So if you have not been on campus, you may not know that when you come to campus every day, we have asked you to go to your app store and to download something called the Reopen CU app. I'm using my iPhone, but the Android application is similar. And for those people that don't have a smartphone, we do have a website that allows you to accomplish the same things. So once you download the Reopen CU app, the first thing that you do is something called symptom checking. And it's a daily attestation in which, and I'm not showing that here because we're really focused on the vaccine, but the prior page of what this app would look like would have you attesting to whether or not you have experienced any COVID symptoms, whether you've been in close contact with anyone with COVID-like symptoms who has tested positive, and whether or not you have tested positive. Once you do that, you check one of those boxes. There'll be further instructions, but hopefully every day when you do this in the morning, you check none of the above and you hit submit, and that's what that submit button up at the top of the screen is. But there's also something that we have asked every person on campus to do, and that's listed under my checklist. And so I'm showing you everything, assuming you have been on campus and then you have fulfilled all the requirements, but you have not yet uploaded your vaccine information. So we have something called the Columbia Health Compact that you can access through the app, a training program, and also some of our testing requirements. So right now, if you haven't uploaded your vaccine information, this is what this first screen on the Reopen CU app would look like. You can go to the next slide. I'm sorry, stay there for 1 second and you'll see, go back, I apologize, go back 1 second. You'll see highlighted faculty and staff, that's who we're speaking to here. The box right now is unchecked. You don't check that because you've got to perform certain operations. What you do is you click on the blue that says faculty/staff. It'll take you to what the next slide looks like. Okay, and so what will show up is the following. It will ask you to attest that you've received the vaccine. You will add in the date. If you look under date 1, you will add in the type of vaccine. This is all pre-populated in terms of the type of vaccine. You'll add in when you got your second dose. You'll add in what your second dose was, and then you will upload a file that you've already taken a picture of and that you have on your phone. You can go to the next screen. So this is what it looks like if you have now filled this out. You've clicked on the attestation. You've added in your 2 dates, March 29th and April 23rd, and you've added in your 2 types of vaccines. You can go to the next slide. And then what you'll get back is a confirmation that you have in fact submitted your COVID-19 vaccine information. And I will show you the final screen in a couple of screenshots. So that's part 1. You have you've already gotten vaccinated and you have the documentation. Again, you're going to upload on that JPEG box on the prior page your actual picture of your CDC card, your WHO booklet, or even a letter from a physician that is confirming that you got vaccinated. The 4th thing you can submit, those of you who've gotten vaccinated at NYP or Columbia, CYMC, is that you have an EPIC record, your personal health record, and you can upload that information. You can go to the next slide. So if in this case you've decided that you want to request a medical or religious exemption, about 3/4 of the way down, you'll see a box that you need to check. Click on that. I'm requesting a medical or religious exemption. Click submit. Go to the next slide, please. And then you'll find information about the exemption process, what you have to complete in terms of forms and where it needs to go. You can go to the next slide. And then finally, so there have been two separate actions that we've taken through these slides. One is actually uploading your information. Once you upload that information, the box on this screen is actually checked for you. You can't check it. And then if you submitted a request for a vaccine exemption after the review period, which is generally 15 days, after we get all the necessary information, if your vaccine exemption is approved, this will also be clicked for you. So that's just a little preview of some of the hows to actually upload it. And again, August 2nd is the deadline. You can take down the slides, and I think let's go to some of the questions. Magda, you started talking about the younger adults, 12 to 16, getting heart issues after the second dose. Is that a reason to delay the second shot? Did we lose Magda?
No, I'm here. Sorry, I just had to, had to unmute myself. Yeah. No, so thanks for that question. So indeed, there have been, a number of reports of these this inflammation of the heart happening in across age groups, but it was deemed that it was a more frequent and kind of in younger, especially male adults. And it hasn't been really determined yet whether or not it's really due to the COVID vaccine or there was something else going on. That's why it's being taken very seriously and being investigated very seriously. But because majority of them have happened after the second dose, it wouldn't be a reason to delay the vaccine because the vaccine would have already been completed. I suppose in the rare instance that there was an occurrence of this inflammation of the heart or pericarditis or myocarditis after the first dose, I think there needs to be a careful conversation with the provider about the risk and the benefit of getting the second dose, especially if there was if it's not sure whether this happened after the vaccine, strictly was caused by the vaccine or not. But majority of them have happened after the second dose when the vaccine series was completed. And really most of the people have recovered fully. And there's this is being, kind of all the data is still being gathered very, very carefully.
Thank you. Magda, we have another question I'll toss your way, which is someone who has elevated white blood cells. Any advice to them in terms of getting the vaccine?
Yeah, so that, that in and of itself wouldn't be a reason to delay or not to take a vaccine. There are many causes of elevated white cell counts, and I think I would just encourage the person to speak to their provider as to about whether there's anything else going on that's causing it. Sometimes infections can cause an elevated white cell count, but in and of itself, there's a range of elevations that can happen. And that in and of itself wouldn't be a contraindication, just has to be a conversation with the provider to find out what's causing it.
I'm going to give you one more since you brought up COVID arm. And the question is, if I got COVID arm with the first dose, should I not get the second dose?
So you can safely get it. Sometimes we tell people to get it in the opposite arm. So the other side than where you had it the first time, but there was absolutely no safety issues and no contraindications to getting the second shot. And sometimes you may get the COVID arm again after the second shot. It can be a little bit more robust, and then taking like Motrin or Tylenol or an antihistamine helps alleviate the symptoms if it really causes a lot of discomfort.
Great. I'm going to turn to Wafaa to ask a question. As I think many of you know, Governor Cuomo today announced, because we hit the 70% of all adults having received their first dose, he announced a lifting of some of the vaccines. And Wafaa, the question is, if there's no restrictions, why do we still have to get vaccinated?
Well, I think there's a kind of a mixing of the restrictions have been eased because of the vaccine coverage. However, we do know that there's a need to continue to try to increase the vaccination coverage even further. So I think the more we can get individuals vaccinated, the more we're able to, with comfort, ease some of the restrictions. And you'll notice that the governor, as you know, Donna, did not remove all the restrictions overall. For example, restrictions remain, for example, in public transport, where people will need to continue to mask, for example, as well as in large aggregation of people or event size or nursing homes or healthcare facilities and so on. So I think this does not mean that all of the restrictions have been removed. There's some that remain in place, and that's because there remains some uncertainty, and this motivates us to continue to try to reach higher levels of vaccination, particularly amongst our community, but also the city as a whole and the country as a whole.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to Gerry, who leads our vaccine committee. And the question is, who sees your COVID-19 vaccine card once it is submitted? Does your direct manager and or HR manager see it?
So we tried to be as clear about this as we could, that we understand there are confidentiality concerns. So our undertaking to you is that this information will be available only to the HR people who need to look at this in order to assess your compliance with the scheme that we have in place. But it's not to be shared with the line managers, your direct boss. That person will not see it.
Great, thank you. And Gerry also leads a group that is focused on what we call the new work environment. It's not so much about return to campus. Many people have been on campus for a long periods of time. The question, and perhaps Lou will chime in as well, is from someone who acknowledges much of what Lou said, which is we've gone through a lot of change, we've gone through a lot of stress. But we've made some difficult transitions, but some of them actually created happier and healthier work lives for people. So Gerry, there's a number of questions in this statement, but I think the main thrust of it is, are we going to be making people come back to work and on site, and what flexibility do managers have in designing what would be the new work environment?
So unfortunately, there isn't a simple answer to this. It's certainly not that we're making everybody come back. The planning for the transition from where we've been to where we're going next is something that has to be taken care of at the local level, at your unit level, your school, your department, your center, your institute. And the people who are in these units are consulting, are talking, are thinking about what kind of work environment is most conducive to all of the objectives that we're trying to achieve here. Safety first, achieving an effective and efficient operation of the university, being attentive to the needs of our employees and concern for their well-being. All of these things need to be taken into account at the local level, and plans need to be put in place that will work. It is, Donna, as you said, one of the odd paradoxes of COVID, that when everybody had to go home, we thought that was just unbelievable hardship, and how would we survive? And now that we're facing the prospect of people coming back, that turns out to be even worse than what we had before. I think the reality of the situation is that change is very, very difficult, understandably so. And we're trying to be cautious, patient, careful in an effort to keep stress as low as possible.
Thank you. I'm going to turn back to Magda. We have a question about autoimmune conditions like Hashimoto's, or, and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation, sarcoidosis. And are those considered to be autoimmune conditions that would allow someone to potentially be exempt from vaccination?
So, so in fact, those are not really contraindications to getting vaccinated. And in some instances, person may even be at a slightly higher risk of getting COVID. And I know that the individuals with some of these autoimmune conditions were included in clinical trials, and they tolerated the vaccine well. So that in and of itself is not a kind of a safety contraindication or a medical exemption to getting the vaccine.
Thank you. Magda and Wafaa, I'll turn to both of you. There is a question about the Delta strain, and could you give us a little bit more of a flavor for what's going on with the Delta strain?
Sure, I can start, and Magda, please add. And the Delta strain or the Delta variant is a variant that was first identified largely in India during the last surge that occurred in India and Nepal, in that region of the world. And of course, one of the findings from this surge was that this new strain, this new variant, was more transmissible, meaning it was easier to transmit from one person to the next. So that, of course, is worrisome. And I think that's why there's been concern about this new variant. There are now reports from many countries around the world, as often happens with variants that are more transmissible. They're being reported in many parts of the world, including from the United States, including reported from here in New York City. So I think that's the concern about these new strains, that if they're more transmissible, they kind of take over, and because they dominate, because they are more transmissible. The good news is that we don't have definitive information that tells us that this new strain is more deadly, causes more severe disease, mixed kind of data on that question. And also it appears that based on very early studies that this strain does not appear to compromise the efficacy of our vaccines.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there, as Wafaa was mentioning, because this strain is taking over some parts of the world, for example, such as in England or UK, there's actually sort of data, as Wafaa was mentioning, that sort of suggests that sort of during the rollout of the vaccines that are being used there right now, they've remained effective against this strain. But it's something to keep in mind. This virus continues to evolve and try to get out from under control of the vaccines. That's why I think it's important to get vaccinated as many people as possible, as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you. Melanie, we're going to put you on the spot now. There is a question about the university's position on social distancing and lower density measures for the fall. And the question is, why are we not going to have physical distancing of 6 feet and density limits when we know there will be some people who are unvaccinated?
We expect that the number of people who are unvaccinated will be very low. In fact, as you already mentioned, we're at the 70% mark in the city. We expect to be much higher than that. So again, the risk is very, very much reduced for the entire population, those vaccinated, obviously, but also the few who have received an exemption. So it will be deemed a fully vaccinated campus, and therefore we will be able to remove those density restrictions.
Thank you. There's a question I'll take a crack at, and Gerry certainly chime in. It is somebody who says they want to go back to the office. Their local HR group says they've not received clearance to allow people back to work yet. When will they hear from a higher authority in order to allow non-essential workers back into the office? There is no higher authority. The people can return to work. We have been having a rolling return to care, I should say return to campus, excuse me. And there are no occupancy requirements. At one point we had to be at 50% occupancy. That was lifted to 100. The only requirements that are still in place until we get to the fall, when the vaccine requirement is being enforced, is that you do need to wear a face covering indoors, and you do still need to do 6-foot distancing. We don't know who is vaccinated at this point. Therefore, those conditions are in place right now. We have a question about who is reviewing the vaccine card. Gerry, do you want to take that, or I can help, whichever? Why don't you start?
So the vaccine cards are being reviewed. We have a process in place to take a look at them, consistent with those confidentiality requirements that I talked about before. But they are being looked at to make sure that the information all checks out. And if there is a problem, you'll be notified. I think we've seen questions in a couple of cases from people who say they entered a data point incorrectly. They got the date wrong for the second vaccine dose, so it doesn't match what's on the card. And if that is identified in our normal process, you'll be notified of that and given an opportunity to correct it.
And just a separate question, but connected, the only people that are reviewing that information are from human resources, okay? Wafaa, I'll turn to you. I have a question that came in. I'm fully vaccinated, sitting in my office with my mask off. Another fully vaccinated person comes in to confer. Do we both need to have our masks on, and do we need to stay 6 feet apart?
Yes, I think at this point in time, the answer is yes, is that even for fully vaccinated individuals indoors, they're required to still wear masks, to be masked, and with the exception if they're in a private office with the door closed. But nonetheless, even if both people are vaccinated, we are still requiring indoor masking. Thank you.
Great. There's a great question because which is less about COVID, but is about what we all know that sometimes we do and others do, and that's we come to work sick. And so the question, and I'm going to pass it off to Melanie because she's got a lot of students that she manages who probably not only come to classes sick, but certainly they're in dorms. So the question is, are there plans to deal with people who have normal illnesses that might be transmitted? As we get back to normal, shouldn't they stay home from work when they have the sniffles? Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of lingering stress about what those sniffles really mean.
A wonderful question. So thank you for whoever posed that. And that's absolutely right. We, even before COVID existed, always encourage students to take care of themselves and our faculty and staff to take care of themselves, not to come to work when sick. So we are going to continue to reinforce that. And as we know, COVID's not the only virus that is going to circulate. We could see more flu. We could see other cough and cold viruses circulating in the fall. So we want to continue to encourage folks to take their symptoms seriously, take care of themselves, prevent transmission of any virus in the workplace or in the classroom, and feel empowered to do so. So we will continue to encourage that. And that's why, right now we continue to use the app, which does ask us to report symptoms, which could be COVID, but could be something else as well.
We have a question. How do I find appointments to get vaccinated on the Uptown campus? Please go to vaccinetogetherny.org, and you'll be able to get an appointment. Wafaa, another question on the Delta variant, and this is though specific to vaccine efficacy against the Delta variant.
Yes, and as I mentioned briefly, is that the data we have thus far, where they've actually looked at how people who've been vaccinated, how their antibodies in their blood responded against the new Delta variant, and the results are encouraging again. It looks like people who've been vaccinated with our current vaccines remain likely to be quite protected against the Delta variant.
Great. Melanie, we have a testing question. Someone wants to know when do they need to get tested? They haven't been on campus. Do they need to do it by August 2nd? And how do they get tested?
Okay, so everyone is required to have a gateway test if you haven't had a gateway test basically in 2021. So if you've been on campus for any reason and had a test, that fulfills your gateway testing requirement. If you haven't been on campus yet, you will need to get a test when you come back. There isn't a magic date. It's really around when you're coming back. So you can separate that from the August 2nd date. It's different to the vaccine. So if you're not coming back till September, you can do your test in September when you come back. We also, I will say right now, if you're coming back, you do have to do that test before you come back to campus. We will have a more open window. So if you aren't coming back till August or September, you can wait on that. and expect to be able to do that test on the day you come back rather than having to make a special trip. We are going to be transitioning to that. Right now, the test needs to be done before your return, but as you're coming back August, September time, that will change.
Thank you. Zev, we've been letting you sit quiet, but no more. We have a question about fertility statistics after the second dose. The comment was that your slide showed it after the first dose. You need to come up.
Very good question, yeah. So the reason that the data for the clinical trials would only have patients who conceived after the first dose for the simple reason that they would be excluded from the original trials. So if someone was pregnant at the time of the clinical trials, they couldn't be enrolled in them. So we do have follow-up data in terms of what happened after people had gotten that dose, but no one would have gotten the first dose when they knew they were pregnant at the time. So that's why we see that. We have, though, good longitudinal data now emerging showing that even after receiving it while you were pregnant, there's some studies where they've studied the placenta of women who got the vaccine while they were pregnant, the VSafe program, and others that have shown that there does not appear to be any harm from getting the vaccine. And again, I go back to the point that I think that where there is a big concern is with the virus itself, and particularly in pregnancy. But thankfully, it seems that antibodies can cross and provide some protection to the child and no evidence of harm, or that the vaccine itself crosses the placenta.
Thanks, Zev. Magda, we have another question about the vaccine and the reality that there are what they call breakthrough cases of COVID. Could you explain that? And if that's the reality, why are we going to drop face coverings?
So yeah, it is a reality, and I think a couple of things to highlight though. Majority of the cases, if not all of the cases that are the breakthrough cases, are sort of mild cases. The reason that they're probably happening is that no vaccine is ever 100% effective. 95% is wonderful, 90% is wonderful, but it's not 100% effective. And sometimes these breakthrough cases can happen when there is a variant that comes into the picture. So a variant that's sort of mutated and kind of escaped from the antibody pressure, from the antibodies that were produced by the vaccine. But again, and sometimes, these cases also happen before the person has been fully vaccinated. So before kind of the full antibody and immune response has been generated and has had a chance to generate. So when someone gets exposed to COVID, maybe between the first and the second dose, or shortly after their second dose. So those are all kind of the possible scenarios that can come into play and lead to this phenomenon that we see of the breakthrough cases. And this is why it's important to, if as many of us get vaccinated as possible, kind of this communal sort of burden of the disease is lowered. The antibody levels of the community kind of, are higher, and we're less likely to transmit to each other as we achieve this kind of community immunity.
I just want to add to Magda is, everything she said is absolutely on target. It's that these events are rare, that these breakthrough events, although they occur, they still are very rare events when you take into account the millions and millions of people who've been vaccinated. So just keep that in mind.
Right. And I just want to close us out, first of all, by thanking the panelists and thanking you for your participation, both in the quiz to give us information about the Reopen CU app, and all of your questions inform the work that we need to do in terms of posting more FAQs. There have been a number of questions, and I want to sum them up around confidentiality. Some of them are, I'm feeling pressure from my colleagues to disclose my vaccine status. You have absolutely no obligation to do that, to your colleagues, to your immediate supervisor, or anybody in the chain. And again, that information is only maintained by human resources. Gerry, do you want to just wrap us up? We have a recording available, as you heard from Robert, but let me turn to you for the final word.
Just final word is thank you to our panelists, to all of those who participated. We have had our 3 wonderful ordinary experts, and we had 3 special guests today. And we're very grateful for your help and for what you've done to keep Columbia safe. So thank you all. See you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.